Last time we mentioned the 4 categories of God's attributes, and in this video I want to look at the first 2 of those, his essential and his relational attributes. Now his essential ones are also called the incommunicable attributes of God, since they can't be communicated from God to his creation. Not in the sense that we can't be told about them, but that we can't possess these attributes or share in them. They can't be attributed to anyone or anything but God alone. Now here are 3 of them. Briefly stated, we can say that God is one. Deuteronomy 6:4 says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." There are not multiple gods. No one can compare with him. He is in a league all of his own. God says of himself in Isaiah 43:10, "There is no other God. There never has been and never will be." Next, God is immeasurable. What device could we possibly use to measure God? Bonaventure describes him this way. He says, God's center is everywhere, God's circumference nowhere. Solomon says in 1 Kings 8 that, "Will God live on earth? Even the highest heavens cannot contain you." Next, God is infinite and eternal. He never had a beginning and he will never have an end. Psalm 90 verse 2 says, "Before the mountains were created, before you made the earth, you are God without beginning or end." Then there are the 3 primary relational attributes of God that describe his power and his knowledge, and his presence in this world. The omnipresence of God is his way of being near. He is everywhere all the time. He is not limited to some specific location. Next is the omniscience, which is God's way of knowing. God knows everything without limitation or condition. He knows all thoughts, all actions, all possible actions, all things that could be that aren't. He knows past, present, and future. One of the challenges, though, around this idea, and this is something that has divided the faithful for hundreds of years, the mystery of God's foreknowledge is much bigger than one of these short video posts. The tension of God's sovereignty and human free will is a massive topic. If God already knows what I'm going to do before I do it, does that somehow take away my freedom? Now this plays out differently for different groups of believers, particularly in the area of salvation. The consensus is that no. Human freedom remains human freedom even if it is divinely foreknown. Now, as if that attribute isn't complicated enough, people also get hung up on this third one, the omnipotence of God. And this is God's way of influencing. You know, he is all powerful, but here's the dilemma. Is there something that God can do that God cannot do? So like Origen ponders this question. He says, could God create a rock so heavy that God could not lift it? Now these types of questions get theology nerds all worked up. We geek out over silly questions like this, and not without reason. If there are limits to what God can do, doesn't that invalidate this idea that God is all powerful? Well, not really. It's a tough concept to grasp, but I think with a simple illustration we can work through it. But if you need to pause this video for a minute, go get yourself a cup of coffee. Make sure you got plenty of coffee before we continue this conversation. I don't mind to wait. In fact, I'm going to go get myself a cup of coffee right now as well. I'll be right back. Okay, so now we have our mental liquid drug coursing through us. Let's address why certain limitations do not call into question God's omnipotence. I have here a coffee cup, and we can look at its attributes, the characteristics that make it what it is. We can see what it's made of, how it's designed, what its purpose is, all those sorts of things, and know its purposeful action. The reason it exists is to hold liquid, more specifically to hold coffee. That's the nature of what it is. Now, asking if God can create something so big he can't move it is like asking if this coffee cup could become a writing utensil. While you could give a yes or no answer, we need to stop and think about what an absurd question this is in the first place. We're asking if one thing can cease being what it is and become something else. Once this coffee cup becomes a pen, it's no longer a coffee cup. It's the same concept with God's omnipotence. Hebrews 6:18 tells us, for example, that it is impossible for God to lie. So does his inability to lie mean that he isn't truly all-powerful? Not at all. As Thomas Aquinas said, omnipotence does not include the power of God to act in ungodly ways. Now, for him to do so would mean that he would cease being who he is. God cannot lie because that would be inconsistent with his very nature. The moment that he lied, he would cease to be God. But since God is infinite and eternal, he cannot cease being who he is. So yes, there are things God cannot do, but that does not limit his power. Rest assured, God has adequate ability to do whatever the being and the power and the knowledge and the goodness of God requires. More importantly for us, let us not spend as much time coming up with questions and ideas about what God cannot do. Instead, let's focus our attention on what God can do. Ephesians 3:20 says, "Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we could think or ask." God's omnipresence, God's omniscience, his omnipotence means so much more for you and for your life than you realize. So take a moment or two right now and begin thinking about what is it in your life, what can God do in your life and through you that is immeasurably more than all you could think or conceive of. Because that is the kind of God that we serve. That is his nature, to be infinitely more, immeasurably more than all we could even conceive of.